Once Upon a Time in the West is a 1968 Western directed by Sergio Leone. The narrative revolves around the contentious ownership of a plot of land called Sweetwater. The railroad is scheduled to run through it due to the land being the only source of water for miles. Frank, an outlaw, murders the owner and his family. Jill, the widow of the owner, arrives in Sweetwater in hopes of taking care of the land she inherited, but is hounded by the outlaws. A man, only called Harmonica, assists her with both the protection of the land and the building of the station. After a series of shootouts and intimidation, the land is secure and kept away from Frank and his cohorts. Harmonica reveals that the real reason he has been trying to sabotage Frank's plans is that Frank once killed his brother. Frank, having murdered so many people over the course of his life, simply did not recognize Harmonica. There's a lot going on in this film, but first, some history. There's something fascinating about the appeal of the Western film across the world in the middle of the 20th century. It's a distinctly American genre, taking place in a specific region of one country. Its bravado, its frontier spirit, its preposterous levels of machismo and antiquated notions of masculinity are so inherently American, so entwined with the region and the time period that one might guess its popularity would only be colloquial rather than international. However, the American Western genre was not only popular among movie audiences worldwide, but also among directors outside of America. Akira Kurosawa was famously inspired by Western films in his creation of YOJIMBO. America participated in this filmmaking cross-cultural exchange by using Kurosawa's Seven Samurai as the basis for the Western film The Magnificent Seven. But while some countries and some directors were inspired by the Western genre in tone and had it influence their works in structure or visuals, others were more interested in simply producing this genre of film, just not in America. The Ostern or Red Western of the Soviet Union, for example. But no country was more successful or more notable in its recreation of the American West than Italy, through the so-called spaghetti westerns or Italian westerns. Maybe, in spite of westerns having this fierce American patriotism and frontier values instilled in them, the more basic elements, the white hats and black hats fighting over good and evil, were universal, even elemental. The most enduring Italian westerns arguably came from Sergio Leone, director of the Dollars trilogy, lifted from Kurosawa, and of course, Once Upon a Time in the West. Leone's love of the genre was tempered by his distance from it, an outsider to the western. And this actually allowed him to approach it differently and uniquely, especially in terms of Once Upon a Time in the West.
Looks like we're shy of one horse.
You brought too many.
This film is not just a western, it's an anti-western. It's a deconstruction of the western, practically postmodern, picking apart its tropes and memetics. The aforementioned black hats versus white hats convention was utilized here with Harmonica in lighter colors and Frank in darker colors, but the twist is that Frank is played by Henry Fonda, who almost exclusively played protagonists up until that point. Fonda initially turned down the role because of this, but was convinced later to join the cast. To put this in modern parlance, Fonda playing a child murderer in Once Upon a Time in the West in the 1960s would be like Tom Hanks revealed to be a serial killer in an R-rated slasher today. This western is a western about westerns. The Dusters, noted in the film as an identifier of their gang, reference the look of the titular character in The Man Who Shot Liberty Vance. The opening scene with the three cronies of Frank waiting for the train mirrors High Noon, in which three men wait for a train to meet a man named Frank. When Cheyenne is arrested for the reward money, he is told he will be sent to a prison in Yuma, a reference to the film 3:10 to Yuma. Actor Woody Strode, one of John Ford's regulars, gets his hero moment in the opening, only to be revealed moments later that he is a villain. There is a multitude of other references. Once Upon a Time in the West is the Western genre equivalent of The Cabin in the Woods, a deconstruction of horror films, only Once Upon a Time in the West is a lot more subtle in its execution. The writers and director of the film spent years drafting the project, much of the research simply involving watching previous westerns. The context of the production of the film helps better understand it. Leone was reportedly done with the genre years prior when he finished The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, claiming at the time that he had nothing more to say within the genre. But with Once Upon a Time in the West, he had the opportunity to say something about the genre instead, that it had collected a great deal of baggage over the years. That, and he wanted to work with Henry Fonda.
What's your name? Benson's dead, too.
You ought to know Frank better than anyone. You killed him.
In a way, this film signaled the end of the Western's heyday. If there was nothing left for the genre except to dissect it, then it wasn't exactly a fresh concept anymore. The Western had become overexposed and was lacking original ideas. And by the time Mel Brooks satirized it in Blazing Saddles in 1974, America could tell that the era of the gunslingers was in decline. But what else makes it significant besides its historical importance? Well, a lot of it comes down to craftsmanship. Let's focus on one scene in particular, the opener. There is no score. We only hear the dropping of water or the creak of a bench repeating into a kind of music all its own. We spend about 13 minutes with these three characters, and because of this extended scene, the audience gets the false impression that these are our three main villains. In reality, at the end of the scene, Harmonica kills them all. They have almost nothing to do with the overall plot. And yet we stay on them and learn about the nature of their lives anyway. One of them has water drop on his head, and rather than move, he almost challenges the water and puts on his hat, and drinks it at the end. The other man is hounded by a fly, and has his own little battle. The idea here is that maybe these men of violence, when there is nothing to do, create their own conflicts because that is all they know. The scene is gorgeous too. It's outdoors and filmed with natural light, and the cinematographer captures these incredible vistas. Again, we get the impression that this is an important scene, and then they're dead. They contribute almost nothing to the narrative, another subversion of our expectations of the classic Western. Only after this long wait for the train do we even hear the epic score, as if we only now can see that the movie has begun. The tropes of the past killed off. Also, the reveal of Harmonica might give the audience the impression that the film will rotate on his axis, that he will be the central figure, but he's really not. The main character, or the person with the most at stake, is arguably Jill, and the principal antagonist, Frank, gets so much screen time that he almost eclipses Harmonica. It's a fake-out, another way of surprising us based on what the audience knew about Westerns up until that point. Harmonica doesn't even have much dialogue.
Inside the dusters there were three men.
So?
Inside the men there were three bullets.
Leone's films, particularly this one, are alternatives to the idealized Westerns that came before, popularized by John Ford. Once Upon a Time in the West is fatalistic. Harmonica does not end up with Jill at the end. Nobody does. Her husband and stepchildren were murdered, and the idea that she would so quickly move on and have a fairy tale ending is nonsense, and the director knew this. Some Westerns romanticize the period, glossing over the morally dubious manifest destiny, the crushing of the Native Americans, the harshness of the times. Leone explored the cruelty of the frontier, having enough distance from the patriotism of American cinema. The train represents the coming future, but it's not a wondrous thing like in so many other films. The train station scene is at first tedious and then gruesome. The arrival of the train later on is exciting, but it's also a kind of ticking time bomb. Everyone is rushing to control it. Leone's vision of the West is anti-romantic. Westerns, though mired in the past, are often about looking towards the future, that destiny of westward expansion that eventually led to the America of today. But in this film, Frank says, the future don't matter to us. Leone once said that Once Upon a Time in the West is a dance of death. All of the characters assume they will die in the end. Morton's body has betrayed him, but he still wants to see the West Coast and look out at the Pacific Ocean. When he dies, instead of the ocean, he collapses in muddy water. All Frank wants to know, in the end, is who Harmonica is, but the only way to learn it is in the throes of death at the end of the duel. Cheyenne, long after being shot and knowing he will die, sticks around to spout his philosophy. and Harmonica's whole life seems to have been about revenge against Frank. Now that Frank has died, Harmonica has seen the figurative end to his own life, and he obviously does not know what to do with what is left. Only Jill seems to have escaped with both her life and a purpose, the mother of a new nation. Thanks for watching the latest episode of Renegade Cut, everyone. If you want to support the show, you can click the orange link to my Patreon. That's how all of this happens. If you want to subscribe and never miss an episode, click on the red link. If you want to watch more, there are some recommended videos below. I'll see you next week for another episode.